I woke to the low hum of a machine and a ceiling I didn't recognize. For a moment, I thought I was still dreaming until the sharp ache in my ribs told me I wasn't. I had been in a coma 3 months, but the first thing I saw when I opened my eyes wasn't a doctor. It wasn't my father. It wasn't my brother. It was an empty room, and a single folded note on the tray beside my bed. 5 words. My father's handwriting. We stopped paying. Good luck. That was it. No explanation, no visit, no voice, no apology. I stared at the note so long that the letters blurred into each other. The nurse told me later what happened, and I cried the way people cry when they're too weak to sob. Quiet, broken, shaking. My father's handwriting, the same clean strokes he used to sign bonuses for people he barely knew, now used to abandon me. The same man who once carried me on his shoulders down our street in Seattle didn't even bother to show up. The silence around me felt heavier than the machines. And growing up, silence was never peace. Silence was the warning before the storm. After my mother died when I was 18, silence became Veronica's favorite weapon. She never yelled. She didn't need to. She could erase you with a single glance away. My father absorbed her coldness. My brother Landon copied it. And I learned to survive it by working. 15 years of building systems no one knew I created. 15 years of ghostwriting proposals, designing the architecture, coding frameworks while Landon presented everything as if he did the work. It's a family effort, he'd joke, tapping my shoulder like I should be grateful. My office? A converted storage closet? No windows. Flickering lights. A chair that leaned left. I told myself it didn't matter. As long as the work was good. As long as someone someday saw me. But in that hospital bed, my ribs aching with every breath, I realized my mother saw everything long before I did. The way they minimized me. The way her absence became their permission to erase the daughter who looked too much like her. Maybe that's why she spent so many late nights in her study with Daniel Price, our estate lawyer. Maybe that's why she left sealed envelopes I never understood. She knew I wouldn't be protected once she was gone. The door clicked softly. A shadow moved. For a heartbeat, hope twisted inside me. Maybe finally my father? But it wasn't him. A familiar voice broke the silence. Caroline. Daniel stepped inside with a careful gentleness, as if approaching someone fragile. Behind him stood a man I didn't know. Tall, sharp suit, sharp eyes. A posture that told you he measured every room before stepping inside. He looked at me not with pity but with recognition. Like he knew exactly who I was. Or who I used to be. Daniel pulled up a chair. I'm glad you're awake. We've been waiting. We, not my father, not my brother, not Veronica, but Daniel, and this stranger, who clearly didn't come without a purpose. My voice cracked. Where's my family? Silence. Daniel's jaw tightened. The stranger's gaze dropped. They didn't answer, because they didn't have to. I already knew. Daniel cleared his throat. Caroline. This is Ethan Ward. He's been advising on your mother's affairs. Ethan stepped forward. The next 72 hours will determine your future. I frowned. My future? Daniel exhaled, slow and steady, bracing himself. Your father is planning a restructuring. The board meets in 3 days at the Tech Summit in San Francisco. As of this morning, he intends to remove you from all strategic authority. My heart slammed against my ribs. I don't have authority to remove. Ethan's voice was calm, cold. That's the point. They've been erasing you for years. Your coma gave them the perfect chance to finish the job. My fingers tightened around the sheet. Finish? Daniel opened a packet of papers. He hesitated, then flipped the first page. Caroline, your father filed documents declaring you mentally incompetent. Permanently. The room tilted. I tasted metal. Ethan leaned closer. He expects you to disappear legally and professionally. But he made a mistake. Daniel nodded. He triggered a clause your mother left behind. My breath caught. Clause? Daniel opened a leather folder. Inside, my mother's handwriting. Familiar loops. Sharp lines. Her voice on paper. She created a trust, Daniel said softly, one your father never controlled. She tied it to a single condition, Ethan added, if your father withdrew support while you were medically incapacitated. Everything she owned transfers to you. Daniel lifted the note my father left. This alone fulfills the clause. We stopped paying. Good luck. The words that broke me, now rebuilt me. Ethan said quietly, your mother's holdings. combined with voting control, give you authority over nearly $1 billion. The air shifted. For the first time since waking, I felt something rise inside me. Heat, purpose, power. My father thought he buried me. He didn't know I'd wake up holding the match. But Caroline, Ethan continued, the board still thinks you the girl from the storage closet office. If you want control, you need proof. You need a plan. Daniel closed the folder. That's why we're here, I whispered. I can't even walk. Ethan shook his head. You don't need to yet. You just need access. He placed a card beside me. My name, my photo. Authorization levels higher than any I'd ever seen. Your mother had this made, Daniel said. She trusted you to use it when the time came, and just like that, I wasn't powerless. I was waking up. 72 hours blurred into a war room of evidence, access logs, internal reports, metadata, task history, all proving what they had stolen. Ethan and I worked through the night. Daniel coordinated everything else. At dawn, the walls were covered in diagrams of betrayal. In the center, my mother's trust clause circled in red ink. You know what will happen when you show up? Ethan asked. I nodded. Yes, they'll finally see me. The day of the summit arrived. The lobby buzzed with executives and analysts, people who had walked past me for years without ever noticing me. Not today. As we approached the hall, a uniformed man stepped in front of me. Security, Miss Mercer? He asked gently. Daniel tensed. But the man, Martin Cole, opened his jacket and handed me a worn notebook. I work nights, he said. For years I saw you come in late, leave early, always alone. I kept notes. Because someone should have. I opened it. Dates, times, project discrepancies, proof, validation, existence. Why help me? I whispered. He shrugged softly. Because I watched them steal from you long enough. And because my wife works in R&D, she says the company survives because of you. I swallowed hard. Thank you. Make them listen, he said. Some of us always knew. Inside the conference hall, bright lights washed over the stage. My father stood there smiling, polished, rehearsed. Veronica sat front row, smug. Landon hovered near the podium, prepared to accept a leadership role built on my work. The announcer called my father's name. Applause, pride, lies. I stepped onto the stage. Silence detonated across the room. My father's smile collapsed. What are you doing here? He snapped. I took the second mic. Good morning. You are not well, he hissed. You shouldn't. What's inappropriate, I said clearly, is declaring your daughter mentally incompetent while she's unconscious. What's inappropriate is abandoning her to cut her out of the company she built. Gasps. I held up the note. He left this beside my bed. The screens lit up legal documents, trust clauses, project logs, metadata, Martin's notebook, everything. My father lunged for the mic. This is private. No, I said. This is truth. A board member stood. I moved for a vote of no confidence. Hands rose. Fast. Final. My father's career ended in minutes. Veronica's poise cracked. Landon's confidence evaporated. I stepped back. For the first time in my life, people weren't looking through me. They were looking at me, seeing me. That night, the board removed all three of them, my father, Veronica, and Landon, from power. They offered me my mother's seat. I accepted. Quiet, steady, my mother's way. When I returned to Seattle, I visited the hospital room, where I woke up alone. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like the starting point of something I was finally strong enough to finish. I did it, Mom, I whispered. I put us back where we belong, and for the first time since she died, I felt her there. Silence around me wasn't frightening anymore. Because silence isn't weakness. Silence is where truth gathers strength. I didn't destroy my family. I stopped letting them destroy me. And what remained wasn't revenge. It was restoration. My mother's legacy finally stood exactly where she intended it to be. If you've ever had to fight to reclaim what was yours, tell me in the comments. And if stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The days after the summit moved, like a storm disguised as calm, because the moment the board handed me authority, the same people who once ignored me now watched every step I took, waiting to see if I would rise or crumble. But what they didn't know was that 3 months in a silent hospital room teaches you more about strength than 15 years of being underestimated ever could. And while headlines exploded with stories of a corporate coup and a daughter taking down her own family, I stayed quiet, studying every department, every hidden file, every shadow my father left behind. Because power means nothing if you don't understand the battlefield you inherited. And as I traced old audit trails, I discovered something far deeper than their betrayal, something my father tried to bury permanently, an off-the-record project labeled Helix buried under layers of encrypted architecture that only someone who built the original systems could recognize. And when I decrypted the first layer, my blood froze because it wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. A mass data harvesting operation run behind the company's public framework and signed off by my father and Landon, using code fragments pulled from work I created when I was 22, without knowing how they planned to twist it. And the deeper I went, the darker it became, with payments routed through shell companies Veronica handled quietly, using identities stolen from employees who no longer worked with us. And I realized their plan wasn't just to erase me, they wanted to secure themselves before the inevitable scandal struck and let me take the fall as the unstable, incompetent daughter, the perfect scapegoat, with no office, no title, no visibility, and no voice. But now I had all four and more. So I called Ethan and Daniel into the glass conference room, overlooking the city my mother once loved, and laid out everything: the logs, the accounts, the encryption timestamps, the digital fingerprints my brother forgot to hide. And Ethan stared at the data like a man watching the spark of a wildfire and said that exposing this would not just destroy my father, it would take down every ally he ever had and fracture the industry itself. But Daniel placed a single envelope on the table and said, "My mother prepared for this too." And inside was a letter written in her careful handwriting saying that power without truth is just another prison, and that if the day ever came when I had to choose between protecting the family name or protecting the people harmed by their ambition, I should choose the latter, because names can be rebuilt, but people cannot. And reading her words lit something inside me stronger than anger, something like purpose. So I made my decision quietly and told Ethan to prepare the legal structure for a controlled exposure with maximum protection for the employees and minimum protection for the people who used me. And over the next 72 hours we built a wall of irrefutable evidence, cross-verified through external auditors who owed my mother favors they never forgot. And when the moment came, I walked into the executive crisis meeting, where the board expected a standard briefing. But instead, I placed the Helix file on the table and told them the truth with the same calm my mother used whenever she ended a storm before it began. And the room erupted with disbelief, panic, denial, and fear as they realized the company they thought was stable had been rotting from the inside long before I stepped onto the summit stage. And as they argued, I felt the strangest thing: quiet confidence, not because I wanted revenge but because I finally understood that my family's downfall wasn't my doing, it was their design. I was just the first one brave enough to stop pretending. And when the board asked what I intended to do, I said one sentence that silenced the room: we rebuild from truth, not legacy. And with those words, everything changed. Investigations launched, positions were suspended, allies turned to enemies, and enemies revealed themselves in the spaces between the panic. And that night, when I walked out of the building, the city lights felt different, not like a battlefield, but like a beginning. Because part 1 was about taking back what was mine, but part 2 was about transforming it into something no one could steal again. Not my father, not Veronica, not Landon, and not the world that once overlooked me. And as I stepped into the quiet street, with the wind carrying the distant hum of the city, I finally understood what my mother meant when she said the strongest battles happen long before anyone knows you're fighting them. And now the real war was beginning, not for control, but for redemption of everything. They broke long before I woke up in that hospital room alone. The morning after the Helix revelation felt deceptively quiet, like the calm before a storm that had already begun, but hadn't hit yet. And while the board scrambled to secure legal counsel, and analysts ran between conference rooms like ghosts, I stayed behind my desk in the executive suite overlooking the city, studying every report, every encrypted message, every log Daniel and Ethan had gathered, because I knew the moment I stepped into public view again, every misstep could be used against me, and the truth was a weapon sharper than any courtroom argument, if wielded with precision. So I sharpened mine, tracing financial flows, internal communications, and project codes that bore my fingerprints but were presented to the world as Landon's. And the more I dug, the more I realized the rot wasn't limited to my family. There were executives, board members, and silent partners who had spent years building their own castles on the foundation of my labor. And while part of me wanted to scream at them to pay for their betrayal, another part of me, my mother's voice echoing in memory, reminded me that exposing them recklessly could destroy the company and everyone depending on it. So I balanced fury with strategy, plotting each move as carefully as she would have. And then Ethan arrived with the encrypted drives, each containing copies of every manipulated document, every falsified report, every secret contract that could ruin a career, a fortune, and reputations. And as he laid them out, I felt a cold thrill, because now I held the story of the last decade in my hands. But the story was mine, and I could decide how it would end. And when Daniel entered, carrying the signed affidavits from external auditors and legal experts prepared to testify to every detail, I realized the board wouldn't be able to ignore the evidence. And yet, before I could act, a call came through from someone unexpected, a whistleblower from my father's inner circle, someone who had quietly observed for years and now wanted to come forward. And when I met him in a secure, windowless room, he handed me a folder containing internal memos, emails, and voice recordings proving Landon's complicity in covering up regulatory violations and financial misconduct. And as I listened, I felt the same fire my mother had left me, that unshakable certainty that justice wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. And that night we worked through the city's lights, plotting disclosures, press releases, and a step-by-step exposure plan that left no room for my father, Veronica, or Landon to manipulate the narrative. And by sunrise, the framework was ready, every piece of evidence cataloged, every ally lined up, every potential risk mitigated. And the first step of the controlled exposure was to confront my father privately before the public storm. So Daniel and Ethan arranged a meeting at his office under the guise of a strategy discussion. And when I walked in, he barely recognized me, not because I had changed, but because the girl he thought powerless, broken, and erased was now someone capable of dismantling everything he thought he owned. And I placed a single file on his polished desk and said calmly, "Everything you built on lies is here. Every secret, every theft, every manipulation. You cannot hide anymore." His face paled, the carefully constructed mask of authority slipping as he realized the daughter he ignored, abandoned and tried to erase, had returned not for confrontation, but for the reckoning. And while he opened his mouth to speak, I let the silence do the work, letting every moment stretch until the weight of my presence and the evidence crushed the room like a tide. And then, without raising my voice, I said, "You made your choices. I am merely here to act on theirs." And in that moment, I understood fully that this was not about vengeance. It was about restoration. And as he stumbled to defend himself, Ethan discreetly recorded every word, every admission, every faltering claim, because control meant nothing without proof. And when I finally left the office, the city outside had no idea that the quiet woman walking past the familiar streets was the same one whose name they had once erased. And the next morning, armed with my mother's trust, Martin's notebook, the whistleblower evidence, and every document from Daniel and Ethan, I entered the press room at the corporate headquarters, ready to reveal the truth, ready to reclaim what had been stolen. And as cameras clicked and reporters whispered, I held up a single file, my voice steady, unwavering. This is the story of a decade of deception, but today, truth begins. And the murmurs erupted into shock, confusion, and the first tremors of the collapse of the empire my father thought he controlled. And in that chaos I felt not triumph, not revenge, but the quiet satisfaction of fulfilling the promise my mother had made to herself and to me years before she left, that no one could erase the legacy of truth. And as the room filled with the evidence of every betrayal, every falsified report, and every manipulated system, I realized that part 3 wasn't about defeating them in public. It was about proving to myself that the girl who had been left alone, broken, and abandoned could rise, orchestrate, and restore everything without becoming the monster they had assumed I would. And by the end of the day, when the board convened an emergency session to validate the evidence and enforce immediate corrective action, every seat of power held by my father, Veronica, and Landon was effectively neutralized, leaving me standing not above them, but in the place my mother had prepared for me, a guardian of truth and a witness to justice finally served. And as I walked out of the building into the fading sunlight, the city lights flickering like distant stars. I finally understood that true power isn't taken, it's proven. And today, I had proven it beyond doubt. City lights flickered below, indifferent, alive, moving on without me. The boardroom was empty, silence hanging thick, but the weight of all I had owned pressed on my shoulders. Richard, Veronica, and Landon had been stripped of all authority. My mother's trust, my work, my rightful place all restored. I walked through the quiet corridors behind the stage, Daniel and Ethan at my side. The tension finally eased from my spine. Nothing built on deceit could survive the light of truth, and I had become that light. I stopped at my mother's old office. Her desk, worn but commanding, felt alive under my fingertips, as if her presence lingered in the quiet hum of the city. Every system I had designed, every late night in the server room, every invisible effort, it all mattered now. I realized what she had taught me silently. Silence isn't weakness. It's the space where truth gathers strength, where power isn't intimidation but purpose. The board reconvened. Richard, Veronica, and Landon were reassigned. Landon, once so confident, now faced the entry-level struggle I had endured for years. I took my mother's seat, fully empowered, fully prepared. I didn't celebrate. I accepted quietly, deliberately, as she would have wanted. Her legacy, her vision, her trust restored to its rightful place. Later, I returned to the hospital room, where I first awoke alone. The machines were gone. The sheets were fresh. The room, once heavy with fear and abandonment, now felt like home. I stood by the window, watching the overcast sky settle over Seattle, while silence wrapped around me like a second skin. "I did it, Mom," I whispered. "I put us back where we belong." I could feel her proud presence, steady and unshakable, as if she had never left. In the subsequent weeks, I lived with the knowledge that silence isn't weakness. It's the space that truth breathes. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had simply stopped letting them destroy me. When all the dust settled, there was no revenge, only restoration. My mother's legacy stood exactly where it belonged, untouched, unbroken, finally honored.